It took the Berlin Fire Department hours to control the blaze. By the time they did, the Reichstag's main debating chamber was destroyed. The gilded cupola was gutted. The building was structurally compromised. The damage was estimated at over $1 million. Inside the building, the police had already made an arrest. A young man, 24 years old, Dutch, found near the burning session chamber. He was panting and sweating despite the cold. He had firelighters in his possession. His name was Marinus van der Lubbe. He confessed immediately. This is a God-given signal. That is what Hitler said when he saw the Reichstag burning. Not, this is a catastrophe. Not, this is terrible. Not even, we must find who did this and hold them accountable. This is a God-given signal. The next 24 hours would demonstrate exactly what kind of signal he believed God had sent him. 24 hours after the Reichstag burned, the German Constitution had effectively ceased to exist. Not by revolution, not by military coup, not by the kind of dramatic seizure of power that political theorists expected dictatorships to require, by a decree, signed by a president, justified by a fire. And 24 days after that, in the Reichstag, what remained of it would pass the Enabling Act, formally transferring all legislative power to Adolf Hitler and his cabinet. Germany's democracy would end not with a battle but with a vote, 444 to 94. The 45 days between the Reichstag fire and the Enabling Act's passage are among the most consequential 45 days in modern history. In that period, Germany moved from a republic fragile, contested, under enormous pressure, but still a republic to a legal dictatorship, from a country with a constitution to a country with a Führer. And the question at the center of all of it, the question that historians have been debating for 90 years and have not definitively resolved is this: did the Nazis start the fire? Here is the extraordinary thing about the Reichstag fire, the thing that makes it the most epistemically complex case study in this season. It does not matter. Or rather, it matters enormously as a question of historical truth. Who was responsible for the arson is a genuine and unresolved question. But the manufactured crisis mechanism that the fire enabled does not depend on the answer. The Nazis manufactured a crisis from the Reichstag fire regardless of whether they started it. If they started it, the manufactured crisis was planned. If they did not start it, the manufactured crisis was improvised. Either way, the crisis was manufactured. And either way, it worked. Marinus van der Lubbe was born in Leiden, the Netherlands, in 1909, by 1933. He had been a council communist, a specific strain of left-wing politics that rejected both Stalinism and parliamentary reformism in favor of worker self-organization for several years. He had been active in Dutch labor movements. He had lost partial sight in both eyes in a 1925 construction accident. Had, in the weeks before February 27, attempted to set fire to the Berlin Welfare Office, a former royal palace, and the city hall attempts that had produced very small fires quickly extinguished, and that had led him to conclude that a more dramatic target was needed to spark the working-class uprising he believed was coming. He chose the Reichstag. He later said he had entered the building through a window in the restaurant wing. He had used his own shirt stripped off and lit as a torch, along with commercially available firelighters he had purchased that day. He had moved through several rooms, setting fires, before the blaze in the debating chamber became serious. He was arrested near the chamber, panting, sweating, stripped to the waist in a burning building in February. He confessed immediately. He maintained, consistently through interrogation, through trial, through the execution that followed, that he had acted alone. The forensic question is genuine and has never been definitively resolved. The fire's intensity, particularly in the debating chamber, has led some historians to argue that a single person, even a determined one, could not have produced it without help, and without more sophisticated incendiary materials than van der Lubbe possessed. Historian Benjamin Carter Het, in his 2013 book, Burning the Reichstag, argued that modern fire science analysis of the available evidence makes the lone arsonist theory physically implausible. Other historians, including Ian Kershaw, one of the most respected biographers of Hitler, have concluded that van der Lubbe's account is credible. Kershaw noted that the building contained a great deal of flammable material, and that van der Lubbe had demonstrated remarkable capability in other ways. The 1964 West German parliamentary investigation concluded that van der Lubbe had acted alone. The 2013 Het analysis challenged this. Walter Gem, the head of the Berlin Fire Department, the man who was physically present directing the firefighting operation, the man who subsequently reported a delayed alarm and restrictions on his response, dismissed 26 days after the fire for presenting evidence of possible Nazi involvement, arrested 4 years later, found strangled in prison 6 years later. The strangling of an inconvenient fire chief is not proof of Nazi arson, but it is the kind of detail that makes the lone arsonist theory harder to accept with complete confidence, and that makes the manufactured crisis mechanism visible regardless of who actually started the fire. Here is what we know with certainty. Within hours of the fire, the Nazi response was operational in ways that implied substantial preparation. Hermann Göring, as Prussian Interior Minister, was the man who controlled the largest police force in Germany. His instructions to the Prussian police on the night of the fire or the morning that followed were specific, comprehensive, and immediately executable. Mass arrests of communist officials, banning of communist newspapers, suspension of communist political activity. This kind of operation arresting specific individuals, shutting down specific publications, banning specific organizations requires lists. It requires knowledge of who you are arresting, where they are, what you are taking from them. It requires, in other words, preparation. The Nazis had that preparation ready. This does not prove they started the fire. Police forces in authoritarian-leaning governments routinely prepare lists of political opponents for potential mass arrest. The preparation may have predated the fire and been activated by it opportunistically, but the speed and the comprehensiveness of the response produced, in many observers who witnessed it in real time, the same reaction. This looked less like improvisation and more like execution of a plan. Sefton Delmer of the British Daily Express was at the scene. He spoke with Hitler directly. He recorded Hitler's words. "You are now witnessing the beginning of a great new epoch in German history. This fire is the beginning. Not, this fire is a tragedy. Not, this fire must be investigated. This fire is the beginning." The beginning of what? Hitler did not specify. But the next 45 days would make clear that what was beginning was the end of democracy in Germany. Whether or not the Nazis started the Reichstag fire, they understood within minutes of learning about it what it represented, the opportunity they had been waiting for, the event they could use to make the move they had always intended to make. The manufactured crisis does not always begin with the manufacture of the precipitating event. Sometimes it begins with the manufacture of the meaning of an event that someone else precipitated. The crisis itself may be real. What is manufactured is the interpretation of the crisis, the attribution of responsibility, the urgency of the response, and the scope of the emergency powers required to address it. The Reichstag fire's manufactured crisis began not when the building caught fire, but when Hitler looked at the flames and said, "This is a God-given signal." The Reichstag fire decree was drafted and signed on February 28, 1933, one day after the fire. One day, The speed of this is the first thing to understand. Drafting a decree that comprehensively restructures the constitutional framework of a country that suspends fundamental rights guaranteed by law, and that expands police powers to the point of eliminating meaningful legal protection for any citizen, is not normally a one-day project. It requires legal drafting. It requires review. It requires, in a functioning democracy, some degree of deliberation. The Reichstag fire decree was signed in one day. This implies either that the Nazis had been working on it before the fire, that it was waiting, drafted, and ready for the right moment, or that it was assembled from pre-existing templates at extraordinary speed. Neither possibility reflects well on the spontaneity of the response. The Reichstag fire decree, officially titled the Decree of the Reich President for the Protection of People and State, suspended the following rights and protections guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution: personal liberty, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, privacy of postal and telephone communications, protections against house searches, protections against property confiscation. That is everything. Every meaningful civil protection that the Constitution provided. Gone. Not amended. Not temporarily restricted. Suspended. Effective immediately. Remaining in effect until, and this is the detail that reveals the Nazis' intentions, most clearly until the decree was formally lifted. It was never lifted. It remained in effect until Germany was defeated by the Allies in May 1945. The emergency protection of February 28, 1933, stayed in force for 12 years. Through the entire duration of the Third Reich, the emergency that justified it lasted one night. The decree it produced lasted 12 years. Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution was the Emergency Powers Clause. It had been written into the Constitution in 1919 as a safety valve, a mechanism for the President to act decisively in genuine national emergencies without waiting for the slower processes of parliamentary deliberation. It had been used repeatedly during the Weimar years, so repeatedly, in fact, that by 1933 governing by presidential decree had become normalized. Previous chancellors had used Article 48 so frequently that the Reichstag's legislative authority had been significantly eroded before Hitler even took office. The Weimar Republic had been practicing emergency governance as a routine matter for years. In this context, the Reichstag fire decree looked like more of the same. An emergency had occurred. The president was invoking Article 48. The procedure was constitutionally legitimate. The difference between the previous uses of Article 48 and the Reichstag fire decree was that the previous uses had been genuine emergency measures, sometimes misguided, sometimes politically motivated, but not designed to permanently eliminate constitutional government. The Reichstag fire decree was designed to permanently eliminate constitutional government. Hindenburg signed it because he genuinely feared communist revolt. The Nazi propaganda of the previous weeks had been specifically designed to amplify that fear, and because the men around him, including his trusted advisors and former Chancellor von Papen, told him it was necessary and temporary. It was neither. The arrests began immediately. Thousands of communists and social democrats were detained in the days following the decree. The Communist Party of Germany's entire Reichstag delegation was effectively eliminated from political participation through arrests and forced exile. Communist newspapers were shut down. Communist meetings were banned. The SA, the Nazi paramilitary occupied communist offices across the country. The legal foundation for all of this was the Reichstag fire decree. The constitutional protections that would have prevented arbitrary arrest, that would have guaranteed freedom of the press, that would have permitted political meetings, all suspended, all gone. Non-communist parties watched the arrests with varying degrees of alarm and accommodation. The Social Democrats, the only party that would ultimately vote against the Enabling Act, understood what was happening but were constrained by the decree itself. Many of their members were also being arrested. Their newspapers were being shut down. Meeting to discuss a coordinated response to the fire decree was itself now legally questionable under the decree. The Center Party, the Catholic center-right party that would prove crucial to the Enabling Act's passage, had no love for communism and was being told by the Nazi-controlled press and the Nazi-controlled government that the emergency was real. The communist threat was genuine, and that any party that opposed the emergency measures was, by implication, soft on the communist menace. This is the manufactured crisis mechanism at its most elegant. It takes a genuine fear, and the fear of communist revolution in 1933 Germany was genuine. Even if the specific threat at that specific moment was substantially exaggerated, and uses it to make opposition to emergency measures feel like opposition to national survival. You are not voting against the Enabling Act. You are voting for the communists. You are not defending civil liberties. You are defending the people who burned the Reichstag. You are not protecting democracy. You are enabling the chaos that destroys democracy. On March 5, 1933, the election that had been scheduled before the fire, and that the fire was designed to influence the Nazis, won 43.9% of the vote. Note that number carefully. 43.9%. Not a majority. Nota mandati. The Nazis campaigned in an environment where they controlled state media, where their paramilitary was intimidating opposition, where the main opposition party had been effectively suppressed by decree, and they still could not win. A majority of the German electorate, 43.9%, Germany's last pre-war election, conducted under conditions that fell catastrophically short of free and fair. And the Nazis still could not reach 50%. This matters because it reveals something important about the manufactured crisis's function. It was not primarily designed to win the election. It was designed to win the election, and then use the election's result to pass a law that made future elections irrelevant. The 43.9% was enough, combined with the DNVP coalition partners' 8%. And combined with the absence of the communists from parliament due to arrests, to proceed to the next step, the Enabling Act. The Reichstag was too damaged to use. The Parliament of Germany would convene in an opera house. History occasionally has a sense of staging. March 23, 1933. The Cruel Opera House. Germany's parliament was meeting to vote on the Enabling Act, officially the Ermächtigungsgesetz. The law to remedy the distress of people in Reich. In plain language, the law that would give Adolf Hitler the authority to pass laws without the Reichstag, to override the Constitution, to rule Germany by decree for 4 years, with the provision for indefinite renewal. It was, in its effect, the legal abolition of the Weimar Republic. To pass, it required a 2/3 supermajority. The Nazis had 43.9% of the vote from the March 5 election. They needed 2/3. The communists were absent, arrested, exiled, or in hiding. Their 81 seats were effectively empty. The Social Democrats were present, 120 deputies, some of whom had been threatened on the way to the building, some of whom arrived to find SA troops standing at the entrance examining their credentials, some of whom understood that their vote today might be the last meaningful political act of their lives in Germany. They showed up. The Center Party's decision to vote for the Enabling Act is one of the most studied examples of catastrophic political miscalculation in modern history. Not because its leaders were evil, they were not, but because they made a rational-seeming calculation that produced an irrational outcome. The calculation went roughly like this. The Nazis have significant power. They control the state. They control the SA. They have the Reichstag fire decree. They will pass the Enabling Act one way or another. If we vote against it, we will be the targets of the emergency powers, and we will lose all capacity to influence what follows. If we vote for it, We will have negotiated conditions, and we will be inside the process, able to moderate it. This is the logic of conditional capitulation. Give them what they want now, on the best terms we can negotiate. So we preserve some leverage for later. It did not work. There was no leverage. Hitler broke the promises. The Center Party was banned by July 1933. Along with every other party, Kaas went to Rome and never came back. The logic of conditional capitulation fails in conditions of genuine authoritarian capture, because the authoritarian's incentive structure is not to moderate. Once you have given them what they need, their incentive is to consolidate, having obtained your vote through promises. They have no need to keep the promises. The Center Party voted for the Enabling Act and was rewarded with elimination. Hitler's speech to the Reichstag on March 23, 1963, was, by any technical measure of political oratory, masterful. He promised the Reichstag would be respected. He promised the position of the president would be maintained. He promised the rights of the federal states would be preserved. He promised the rights of the Christian churches would not be infringed. He promised the judiciary would remain independent. He promised that the 4-year emergency powers he was requesting would be used with restraint. Every one of these promises was broken, some within months. But in the specific moment of March 23, 1963, the promises were made in full oratorical command, in a building surrounded by armed paramilitary forces, to a parliament that was making a choice that was not entirely free. Otto Welles stood up. He was the chairman of the Social Democratic Party. He was speaking in a building surrounded by SA troops. He was speaking in a country where his party members were already being arrested under the Reichstag fire decree. He was speaking to a parliament that was about to vote to hand unlimited power to the man who was, at that moment, making promises he would break. He said, in a voice that witnesses described as calm, at this historical hour, we German Social Democrats pledge ourselves to the principles of humanity and justice, of freedom and socialism. No enabling law gives you the power to destroy ideas which are eternal and indestructible. He then said something that was both practically meaningless, the act would pass regardless, and permanently meaningful. You can take our freedom and our lives, but you cannot take our honor. Hitler responded with contempt, interrupting the session to deliver an angry response. He had not expected opposition. He was not accustomed to it. He was furious. The Social Democrats voted no. All 94 of them who were present, all of them knowing it would make no difference. The final vote, 444 to 94. The Enabling Act passed with the support of every party except the Social Democrats, the Nazis, the German National People's Party, the Center Party, the Bavarian People's Party, the State Party, and several smaller middle-class parties. 2/3 of Germany's democratically elected parliament voted to eliminate democratic governance in Germany. The Weimar Republic ended not with a revolution but with a law, not with tanks in the streets but with hands raised in a parliament, not with the violent overthrow of democracy but with democracy voting to abolish itself. 444 to 94. This is the most disturbing fact about the Nazi seizure of power, and the fact that makes the Reichstag fire mechanism so important to understand. The Enabling Act was legal. It was passed by the constitutional requirement for a supermajority. It was signed by the president. It was ratified by a parliament. The procedure was correct. The democracy had voted, and what the democracy had voted to do was to end the democracy. Outside the Kroll Opera House, the SA celebrated. Inside, the Social Democrats, the only people who had done the right thing, left. The Parliament of Germany, a meeting for perhaps the last time in any meaningful sense. dispersed into a country that had just legally become a dictatorship. The fire had been February 27. The decree had been February 28. The vote had been March 23. 24 days, from an arsonist in a burning building to the formal end of German democracy. 24 days. What happened between March 23 and July 14? 1933is worth documenting with some precision because the specific sequence of democratic institutions being dismantled is not merely historical narrative. It is a template that has been partially reproduced in other contexts, and that deserves to be understood in its mechanics. Step 1. Eliminate the opposition's capacity to function. The Reichstag fire decree had done most of this work already, but the Enabling Act completed it. Communist deputies were banned from taking their seats. Communist newspapers were shut down. Communist meetings were banned. The Communist Party was effectively dissolved as a functioning political organization before the Enabling Act even passed. The Social Democrats took slightly longer. Their newspapers were banned under the Reichstag fire decree. Their offices were occupied by SA troops. Their members were arrested. The party was formally banned on June 22. 1933, under a law that declared the SPD a subversive organization. Step 2. Destroy the independent labor movement. On May 1933, 5 days after International Workers' Day was celebrated with mandatory Nazi-organized events, SA and SS troops occupied trade union offices throughout Germany. Simultaneously, across the country, union leaders were arrested. Union funds were seized. Union buildings were occupied. The German Labor Front was created as the replacement, not a union in any meaningful sense, but a Nazi organization that organized workers in the service of the regime rather than in the service of workers' interests. The labor movement that had been one of the most powerful in Europe, that had been the backbone of the SPD and the organizational infrastructure of German working-class political life, was destroyed in a single day. Step 3. Force the remaining parties to dissolve themselves. The Center Party, which had voted for the Enabling Act, dissolved itself on July 5. 1933. It had existed as a party since 1870. It had helped build the Weimar Republic. It had navigated the political crises of the 1920s. It had voted for its own destruction in March and formalized that destruction in July. The German National People's Party, the conservative nationalist party that had been Hitler's coalition partner, whose leaders had told each other they could control him, whose Hindenburg connection had given the Nazi government its initial constitutional legitimacy, dissolved itself on June 27. 1933. The State Party, the Bavarian People's Party, the German People's Party, Onebuan, through June and early July. The parties that had coexisted with and sometimes competed with the Nazis dissolved themselves or were dissolved. On July 14, 1933, Bastille Day, the anniversary of the French Revolution, Germany officially became a one-party state. The law against the establishment of parties made the Nazi Party the only legal political organization in Germany. Anyone who attempted to maintain another party faced imprisonment. The law was not temporary. It was not subject to review. It was the legal codification of a monopoly on power. 4.5 months. From the Reichstag fire to the one-party state. 4.5 months. The timeline is important because it reveals the architecture. Each step used the legal authority created by the previous step. The fire justified the fire decree. The fire decree enabled the mass arrests of communists. The mass arrests removed communist deputies from parliament. The removal of communist deputies reduced the votes needed against the Enabling Act. The Enabling Act gave Hitler legal authority to pass laws without parliament. The legal authority eliminated trade unions. The elimination of trade unions weakened the SPD's organizational base. The weakened SPD was banned. The banned parties left the legal basis for declaring a one-party state. It is a chain. Each link is connected to the previous one. And at the beginning of the chain, a fire. Whether the fire was deliberately set by the Nazis, opportunistically seized from an anarchist arsonist, and or something in between the chain, it started runs in one direction and ends in one place. On March 22, 1933, one day before the Enabling Act vote, the first Nazi concentration camp opened at Dachau, outside Munich. It was presented as a work camp for political prisoners, communists, social democrats, and others deemed threats to public order under the Reichstag fire decree. Dachau was not. In March 1933, the death factory it would become. It was a political prison, brutal, lawless, designed to intimidate and destroy political opposition through arbitrary detention and physical abuse. But it was the beginning of an infrastructure whose endpoint would be Auschwitz. The fire decree had enabled arbitrary arrest. Dachau was where the arrested people went. The chain from the Reichstag fire to the Holocaust is not short or simple. It runs through many subsequent decisions and escalations, but it begins with the legal authorization for arbitrary detention that the manufactured crisis provided. On May 1933, 71 days after the Enabling Act, books burned in university squares across Germany. The book burnings were organized by the German Student Union, not the SS, not the SA. Students, university students, who gathered in cities across Germany to throw books onto fires, books by Jewish authors, by Marxist authors, by Sigmund Freud, by Magnus Hirschfeld, by Erich Maria Remarque, by Heinrich Mann, by Bertolt Brecht, by Heinrich Heine, who had written, a century earlier, the line that has become this event's most famous epitaph: where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people also. Heine wrote that in 1820, about a different historical moment. He was quoting a line from his own play. Set in medieval Spain, he did not live to see his own books burned in Germany. He died in 1856. His books burned in 1933. The students who burned them were demonstrating something important about the manufactured crisis mechanism. It does not merely give authoritarian leaders power. It creates social permission, an environment in which previously unacceptable acts become acceptable, in which people who would not have participated in barbarism before the crisis actively participate in it after. The crisis does not just suspend civil liberties in law. It suspends civil inhibitions in practice. It tells a population that the emergency justifies things that peace did not permit, and a population that has accepted this framing can be moved incrementally. Each step prepared by the previous to places that would have seemed inconceivable at the outset. By the end of 1933, Germany was unrecognizable from the country it had been at the start of the year. The political parties were gone. The trade unions were gone. The free press was gone. The concentration camps were open. The books had burned. The university faculties had been purged of Jews and political opponents. The legal system had been restructured to serve the regime. The civil service had been cleansed of those deemed unreliable. All of this built on one fire, on one decree, on one vote. 444 to 94. The Nazis expected the Leipzig trial to be a show trial. They had charged von der Lubbe and 4 communist leaders with arson and communist conspiracy. They had built their entire manufactured crisis on the claim that the fire was a communist plot. The trial was supposed to confirm the claim, provide the documentary record, and close the question of the fire's origins with the official verdict the Nazis needed. It did not go as planned. Dimitrov's defense strategy was simple. He was going to demonstrate, in open court, with the press watching, that the prosecution had no evidence connecting him or the other communist defendants to the fire. He did this by asking very direct questions of prosecution witnesses, including, memorably, Hermann Göring himself. When Göring testified, Dimitrov asked him repeatedly for specific evidence, not assertions. Not conclusion, but evidence that the Communist Party had planned the arson. Göring could not provide it. He grew angry. He shouted at Dimitrov. He threatened him. Göring, the Prussian interior minister, and the second most powerful man in Germany at that moment, was visibly outmaneuvered by a Bulgarian communist he was trying to execute. The exchange was reported internationally. It became one of the more celebrated courtroom moments of the decade. The verdict, delivered on December 23, 1933, was Marinus van der Lubbe, guilty of arson and treason. Ernst Togler, Georgy Dimitrov, Vasil Tanev, Blagoy Popov, acquitted. Insufficient evidence of communist involvement. The German Supreme Court, operating within the Nazi state, under considerable political pressure, had nonetheless determined that the communist conspiracy claim was not supported by evidence. It convicted the arsonist. It acquitted the alleged conspirators. The manufactured crisis narrative had gone to trial and failed to produce the verdict it required. Van der Lubbe was guillotined on January 10. He was 24 years old. He had been convicted under a law passed retroactively specifically to make his offense capital, the Lex van der Lubbe, as it was sardonically known, a law named for the man it was designed to kill. The retroactive application of the death penalty violated the Weimar Constitution's prohibition on ex post facto punishment. The Enabling Act had made this violation legal. Within weeks of the fire, the German communist exile community in Paris, led by Willy Munzenberg, the most skilled communist propagandist in Europe, published the Brown Book on the Reichstag fire and Hitler terror. The Brown Book argued that van der Lubbe was a Nazi agent, that the Nazis had orchestrated the fire through the SA, and that the entire manufactured crisis was a deliberate, planned operation. It named names. It described mechanisms. It claimed specific evidence. It became a bestseller in 24 languages. And it was, in substantial parts, fabricated. The historian Anson Rabenbach has described the Brown Book as communist disinformation responding to Nazi disinformation. The Nazis had manufactured the crisis. The communists manufactured the counter-narrative. Both sides were producing propaganda rather than history. This created a long-lasting, epistemic problem. The question of whether the Nazis had started the Reichstag fire became entangled, for decades, with the question of whether you were relying on Nazi sources or communist sources, and neither was reliable. The dominant post-war historical position that van der Lubbe had acted alone rested substantially on the work of Fritz Tobias, a West German police official who conducted a thorough investigation of the fire in the late 1950s and published his conclusions in 1962. Tobias's conclusion: van der Lubbe acted alone. The fire was not a Nazi operation. His work was influential and remained the dominant position among historians until the early 21st century. But historian Benjamin Carter Hett, in his 2013 book, Burning the Reichstag, raised serious questions about Tobias's methodology. Hett showed that Tobias had been working under specific institutional constraints. He was originally tasked with defending former SS members, which shaped what evidence he was inclined to find credible, and that he had systematically disregarded evidence from people who had been victims of the Nazi regime while accepting the testimony of former SS members as objective. Had also presented fire science analysis suggesting that the destruction of the debating chamber was inconsistent with what one person with firelighters could have produced in the time available. Where does the historical consensus stand in 2024? The honest answer is genuinely contested. Ian Kershaw, whose biography of Hitler is the standard scholarly reference, has written that the consensus of nearly all contemporary historians is that van der Lubbe set the fire. He acknowledges the debate but considers it essentially settled in favor of the lone arsonist. Richard J. Evans, another leading historian of Nazi Germany, has labeled the Nazi arson theory a conspiracy theory and argued that the lone arsonist conclusion is well supported. Benjamin Carter Head, whose 2013 book represents the most comprehensive recent challenge to the lone arsonist consensus, has argued that the fire science evidence and the documentary record make it implausible that van der Lubbe acted entirely alone. In 2008, the German government posthumously pardoned Marinus van der Lubbe, not for the arson. The pardon did not address whether he had set the fire. It addressed something more specific. The Lex van der Lubbe, the retroactive law that had been created to make his offense capital, was an ex post facto violation, an injustice independent of his guilt or innocence for the fire itself. He was pardoned 74 years later for being executed under a law that should not have existed. He was 24 years old when they guillotined him. Whether he started the fire alone, with help, or as a pawn, he was 24 years old when the state killed him for it. Here is what the historical debate, for all its genuine uncertainty, does establish with clarity: whether or not the Nazis started the Reichstag fire. They manufactured the crisis. The fire, its cause still debated, was the raw material. The crisis was the product, and the crisis was manufactured with a speed, comprehensiveness, and effectiveness that is inconsistent with improvisation. The Reichstag fire decree was signed within 24 hours. The mass arrest lists were ready. The decree's language had been prepared. The institutional response was coordinated and comprehensive. The propaganda framing communist conspiracy, threat to the nation, necessity of emergency measures was deployed within hours. Either the Nazis planned the fire and the crisis together, or they had been preparing for exactly this kind of crisis for some time and recognized instantly that the fire was the event they had been waiting to exploit. In both cases, the manufactured crisis was a deliberate political operation. In both cases, a genuine emergency, a fire was transformed through specific, prepared institutional actions into a pretext for the elimination of constitutional government. The question of who held the match is historically important. The question of who manufactured the crisis is historically decisive. And the second question has a clear answer: the Nazis. Göring never answered Dimitrov's question satisfactorily. He never had to. The acquittal of the communist defendants was immediately followed by their expulsion from Germany, ensuring no further legal proceedings could produce inconvenient discoveries. The People's Court replaced the Supreme Court for political cases, ensuring future trials would produce the verdicts the regime required. The question remains open. The consequences were not. Let us now do what this season has done after each case study. Build the anatomy of the mechanism. The manufactured crisis has a specific structure, different from the manufactured enemy. The manufactured defeat. The manufactured nobility. The manufactured guilt. And the manufactured perpetrator. The manufactured crisis is the most efficient of the big lie mechanisms, because it does not require a false claim to be believed indefinitely. It requires only a false or amplified interpretation of a real event to be accepted in the moment, long enough for the response to the crisis to be implemented. After that, the response is self-sustaining. The emergency powers, once obtained, do not depend on continued belief in the emergency. The manufactured crisis operates in 5 steps. Step 1. The precipitating event. The manufactured crisis requires a real event, or at least a plausible one. The Reichstag fire was real. The building genuinely burned. The crisis does not require the event to be manufactured in the sense of being entirely invented. What is manufactured is the interpretation of the event, its attributed cause, and the urgency of the required response. This is an important distinction. The manufactured crisis is not primarily a lie about what happened. It is a lie about what it means, who caused it, and what must be done about it. The precipitating event can be a real event caused by the people who claim to be responding to it, a real event caused by someone else, seized opportunistically, a real event whose scale is genuine but whose political significance is massively amplified. In rare cases, a fabricated event. All four variants have appeared in history. The Reichstag fire may have been the first, or the second. The manufactured crisis mechanism works in all four cases, which is one of the reasons it is so difficult to counter. The crisis may be real, even when the response to it is manufactured. The most studied contemporary example of a real crisis being used to justify measures that extended beyond the immediate threat is the period following the September 11, 2001 attacks. This requires care. The comparison to the Reichstag fire is often made and is genuinely instructive in some dimensions and genuinely misleading in others. The United States after September 11 was not the Weimar Republic after the Reichstag fire. American democratic institutions were not eliminated. The Use a Patriot Act, the authorization for use of military force, and the various executive orders issued in the months after the attacks were not the equivalent of the Reichstag fire decree. The United States did not become a one-party state. Courts functioned. Elections continued. Opposition parties organized. The press reported critically. These are not trivial differences, but some structural elements of the manufactured crisis mechanism were present. A real and terrible, precipitating event. A political atmosphere in which questioning the scope of the emergency response was characterized as insufficient commitment to national security. On the passage of major legislation at speed that made careful deliberation difficult, and the expansion of executive power beyond what the immediate threat required. The 2004 Intelligence Reform Act, the 2001 AUMF, which remained in force for decades, and authorized military operations in contexts far removed from its original justification. The domestic surveillance programs that the Snowden disclosures revealed were operating beyond their statutory authorization. These were not equivalent to the Reichstag fire decree, but they were produced by the same mechanism operating within a much more robust institutional context, a context that limited, though did not eliminate, the mechanism's effects. The difference between 1933 Germany and 2001 America was not that the manufactured crisis mechanism was absent. It was that American democratic institutions were strong enough to constrain it. The Weimar republics were not. This is the lesson. And it is the most important lesson of this season's final case study. The manufactured crisis mechanism does not automatically produce dictatorship. What it produces depends entirely on the strength and independence of the democratic institutions it encounters. Step 2. The attribution of responsibility. Once the precipitating event has occurred, the manufactured crisis requires a specific attribution of responsibility to an enemy, preferably one that the population already fears, already associates with threat, and that is not in a position to mount an effective counter-narrative. In 1933, the enemy was the communists. The fear of communist revolution was genuine. The Soviet Union existed. The communist parties in Germany and other European countries were active opponents of the incumbent governments. And the economic misery of the Depression had radicalized significant portions of the German working class. The attribution was plausible, because the underlying fear was real. The manufactured attribution does not have to be entirely invented. It has to be advanced in advance of the evidence, with more certainty than the evidence supports, in service of a political agenda, that the evidence is being used to justify. Hitler said, as standing at the burning Reichstag. This is the work of the communists acknowledging the conditional, but he was already responding as if the attribution were established. By the following morning, the conditional had been dropped. The attribution was being stated as fact. The manufactured attribution's most important quality is not its accuracy. It is its timing. The attribution must be made before the evidence can be examined, before investigators can establish the facts, before critics can raise questions, before alternative narratives can organize. In 1933, the speed of communication was limited enough that the Nazi attribution of the fire to communist conspiracy had hours to establish itself before organized skepticism could appear. The next morning's newspapers, which the Nazi regime was already controlling or influencing, carried the official narrative. The decree suspended the opposition press before it could systematically challenge that narrative. In the contemporary information environment, the attribution timeline is compressed further. A manufactured crisis interpretation can circulate globally within minutes, but so can the skeptical counter-narrative. The race between the manufactured crisis and the counter-narrative has gotten faster in both directions. Step 3. The emergency legislation. The manufactured crisis mechanism's defining move is the conversion of the crisis into emergency powers. This requires the crisis to be presented as requiring extraordinary measures that would not be acceptable in normal circumstances, but that the emergency makes necessary. The Reichstag fire decree suspended civil liberties that had been constitutionally guaranteed. The justification was not that the civil liberties were bad policies. It was that the emergency required temporarily setting them aside. The word temporary was used. The emergency was presented as finite. The measures were presented as proportionate responses to a specific threat. Every one of these framings was false. The measures were not temporary. The emergency was not finite. The measures were not proportionate. They eliminated every meaningful check on arbitrary state power. But in the moment of the crisis, with the building still smoking, with the communist conspiracy narrative dominating the press, with the terrified president being told that this was the beginning of a revolution that could destroy Germany in that moment, the falseness of the framings was not yet apparent. The emergency legislation's success depends on speed. It must be obtained before the population and the relevant institutions can fully evaluate whether it is proportionate and genuinely temporary. The Reichstag fire decree was signed in 24 hours precisely because the window of perceived urgency that justified it was narrower than the window needed for careful deliberation. Step 4. The irreversibility. The manufactured crisis's most important feature is that the powers obtained through it become very difficult to reverse. This occurs for two reasons. First, the emergency powers themselves make the opposition that would reverse them politically much harder to organize. The Reichstag fire decree made political opposition meetings, newspapers, campaigns legally questionable. The Enabling Act made it irrelevant. The manufactured crisis powers can be used to eliminate the political forces that would otherwise challenge those powers. Second, the people who voted for the emergency legislation, the Center Party, the DNVP, the other parties that supported the Enabling Act, have a vested interest in believing that they made the right decision. Acknowledging that the emergency was manufactured requires acknowledging their own complicity in its consequences. This is psychologically costly, and the manufactured crisis mechanism is designed to ensure that the full consequences of the emergency powers are only visible after the irreversible commitments have been made. The Center Party voted for the Enabling Act on March 23. It was banned on July 5. Less than 4 months. Not enough time to undo the vote. Not enough time to organize meaningful resistance. The irreversibility was built into the sequence. Step 5. The normalization. The final step of the manufactured crisis mechanism is the normalization of the emergency as the ordinary condition. The emergency powers become the standard operating procedure. The suspension of civil liberties stops being described as a suspension and starts being described as the new normal. The crisis that justified the emergency recedes in public consciousness while the powers it generated remain fully in force. In Nazi Germany, this process took approximately 6 months. By July 1933, the emergency of February was already history. The one-party state was the present. The emergency had served its purpose and could be retired from active deployment in the public narrative. What it had produced, the dictatorship, did not need the emergency narrative to sustain itself. It had its own mechanisms now. This is the manufactured crisis's final trick. It is self-eliminating. Once it has produced the conditions it was designed to produce, it becomes unnecessary. The crisis disappears. The powers remain 12 years, 2 months, and 11 days. That is how long the Nazi dictatorship lasted. From the Reichstag fire decree to the German unconditional surrender. In those 12 years, 6 million Jewish people were murdered in the Holocaust. An estimated 50 to 80 million people died in the Second World War that Nazi Germany started. Germany itself was reduced to rubble. The Reichstag building stood throughout. Its cupola gone, its interior gutted. A monument to the night that the manufactured crisis began. On April 13, 1942, Soviet soldiers raised a flag over the ruins of the Reichstag. Not over the Reich Chancellery, which would have been the more symbolically obvious choice, but over the Reichstag. The building that the Nazis had used to start their story was the building the Soviets chose to mark its end. The Norman Foster cupola that was added to the Reichstag when it was restored for reunified Germany is a glass dome. Transparent. Visitors can walk its spiral ramps and look down through a glass floor into the Bundestag chamber below can see, literally, the parliament at work. This was a deliberate architectural decision. A country that had watched democracy vote to end itself in 1933 decided, when rebuilding the institution of democracy in 1999, to make it literally transparent, to build visibility into the architecture. It is a beautiful building. It is also a statement about what happens when democracy operates in darkness, when the governed cannot see what is being done in their name, when emergency powers are invoked behind closed doors, when the manufactured crisis produces decrees that are signed before the population can fully evaluate them. The glass cupola is Germany's architectural answer to the Enabling Act. You can see through it. Let us end not just this episode but this season with the question that all 6 case studies have been building toward. What do these 6 mechanisms have in common? Not in their surface. Features their specific historical contexts. Their specific lies. Their specific political consequences are all different, but in their deep structure, in the thing that makes each of them a big lie, rather than merely a false claim. The protocols manufactured an enemy, a conspiracy that did not exist, attributed to a people who had not committed it, for the purpose of redirecting fear and hatred toward a convenient target. The stab in the back manufactured a defeat, a military failure that was real, was converted into a betrayal that was invented, for the purpose of avoiding accountability and building a grievance that could be weaponized. The lost cause manufactured nobility. A war fought for an indefensible purpose was given an honorable retrospective framing, for the purpose of sustaining a racial hierarchy after the military defeat that might otherwise have dismantled it. The Dreyfus Affair manufactured guilt. An innocent individual was made to bear responsibility for a crime he had not committed, for the purpose of protecting the institution that had made the original error from the consequences of acknowledging it. Katyn manufactured a perpetrator. A crime that genuinely occurred was attributed to a different actor, for the purpose of protecting the actual perpetrator from accountability and delegitimizing the victims' demands for justice. The Reichstag fire manufactured a crisis. A real or possibly manufactured event was converted, through deliberate institutional action, into an emergency that justified the elimination of the democratic structures that constrained the people invoking the emergency. 6 mechanisms, 6 different functions, 6 different emotional registers, 6 different institutional settings. One common thread. The common thread is this. Every big lie examined in this season was deployed by people who had something to protect: power, reputation, impunity against people who had the capacity to threaten that protection. The lie was the weapon. The target was accountability. The protocols protected the Tsarist secret police from the consequences of the revolutionary pressures building in Russia by giving those pressures a false target. The stab in the back protected Ludendorff and the German military leadership from accountability for a military failure by attributing it to civilians and Jews. The lost cause protected the Confederate leadership's legacy and the post-war white Southern political structure from accountability for a war fought to preserve slavery by rewriting what the war was about. The Dreyfus Affair protected the French army's institutional credibility from accountability for a wrongful conviction by sustaining the conviction rather than acknowledging the error. Katyn protected the Soviet state from accountability for mass murder by attributing the murder to its enemies. The Reichstag fire protected the Nazi movement from accountability to the democratic institutions that constrained it by eliminating those institutions under cover of emergency. Every big lie is, at its core, an attack on accountability. This is the pattern that repeats across 6 episodes, 6 countries, 6 historical moments. The specific lies change. The mechanism, the use of false or distorted information to avoid accountability while attacking the people who would enforce it, is constant. The big lies in this season did not primarily attack true claims. They attacked the institutions that produced and protected true claims. The protocols attacked the credibility of the journalists and historians who exposed them. The stab in the back attacked the Weimar Republic's authority to tell the story of the war's end. The lost cause attacked the academic historians who documented slavery as the war's cause, and the Black Americans whose testimony contradicted the mythology. The Dreyfus Affair suppressed Piquet and prosecuted Zola. Katyn suppressed the Polish government in exile and imprisoned the families who mourned incorrectly. The Reichstag fire decree suppressed the communist press and the social democratic press, and eventually every press that was not the Nazi press. Truth, on its own, is not dangerous to power. Truth with institutional backing, with a press that publishes it, courts that act on it, elections that punish those who ignore it, civil society that organizes around it, is dangerous to power. This is why every big lie includes, as part of its mechanism, an attack on the institutions that would otherwise make the truth actionable. The lie does not just say something false. It destroys or discredits the infrastructure that would otherwise expose the falseness. But the institutions recovered. Not always. Not quickly. Not without enormous cost. But they recovered. Philip Graves published his 3-part series in the Times in 1921 and proved the protocols were plagiarism. Piquet went to Tunisia, rather than stay silent, and eventually became Minister of War. The academic historians of the 1950s and beyond documented what the Civil War was actually about, and the lost cause has been retreating ever since. Poland outlasted the Soviet system that maintained the Katyn lie, and received in 1992 the Beria Memorandum with Stalin's signature. The Otto Welles speech at the Crowell Opera House on March 23, 1933. You can take our freedom and our lives, but you cannot take our honor, is remembered. The vote it lost is remembered too, but differently. The institutions that the big lies attacked were damaged. Some were destroyed, but others survived. And the survival matters not because it means the truth always wins, but because it means the truth can win under specific conditions. If the institutional infrastructure that supports it is maintained, the manufactured crisis is the most efficient of the 6 mechanisms in this season because it is the most direct attack on the accountability infrastructure. The protocols and the lost cause and the stab in the back tried to change what people believed. The Dreyfus affair in Katyn tried to protect specific crimes from specific accountability. The manufactured crisis tries to eliminate the institutions of accountability themselves. It is the big lie that goes after the source. And this is what makes the Reichstag fire the appropriate ending for this season. It is the mechanism that explains how all the other mechanisms become possible at scale. The protocols circulated for decades in European society, but produced their worst consequences, the Holocaust, only after the manufactured crisis of 1933 had eliminated the institutional constraints that might otherwise have limited those consequences. The stab-in-the-back myth circulated through the Weimar Republic for 15 years. It produced Hitler because the manufactured crisis of 1933 translated the myth's political energy into governmental power. The lost cause circulated for a century in American culture. Its most directly harmful expressions: Jim Crow, the disenfranchisement of black voters. The systematic suppression of black civil rights was sustained by the manufactured crisis of Reconstruction's failure, by the calculated withdrawal of federal accountability from the post-war South. The manufactured crisis is not simply one of 6 big lie mechanisms. It is the mechanism that turns the other 5 from propaganda into policy. The manufactured crisis mechanism did not end with the Third Reich. It has appeared in varying degrees, with varying outcomes in multiple subsequent contexts, not always as a full-scale elimination of democracy. Sometimes as a partial expansion of executive power beyond what the precipitating event warranted. Sometimes as the invocation of emergency to suppress specific opposition while leaving the broader institutional framework intact. Sometimes at the scale of a nation-state. Sometimes at the scale of a company, a university, a community institution. The mechanism scales. What changes is the strength of the institutional resistance it encounters. The contemporary manufactured crisis operates in a different information environment than 1933-1, in which the mechanism is less able to control the attribution before counter-narratives organize, less able to suppress the independent documentation that challenges emergency claims, and less able to eliminate the institutional checks that would otherwise constrain emergency powers. But it also operates faster. The window between precipitating event and emergency legislation, which was 24 hours in 1933, can now be compressed to hours. The window between emergency legislation and its entrenchment can be compressed from months to weeks. The irreversibility problem is accelerated as much as the information environment's openness constrains it. What breaks the manufactured crisis? Not primarily debunking the false attribution. The attribution, once made and accepted in the crisis moment, is very difficult to retroactively correct. What breaks it is institutional resistance to the emergency legislation, the insistence that emergency powers be specific, proportionate, time-limited, subject to judicial review, and reversible. The Otto Welles speech was the right response. It changed nothing in 1933 because the Weimar Republic's institutional infrastructure was too weak to give it purchase. In a stronger democracy, it would have been the beginning of a coalition that limited the emergency powers scope. What breaks it is an independent press that maintains skepticism even in the crisis moment, that asks immediately whether the attribution is supported by evidence and whether the proposed response is proportionate to the documented threat. What breaks it is a judiciary with the independence and the institutional backing to apply proportionality review to emergency legislation, to evaluate whether the measures being proposed actually address the stated emergency. And what breaks it? over time, is the accumulated institutional memory of what manufactured crises look like, this specific pattern of precipitating event. False attribution, emergency legislation, irreversibility attempt that makes the mechanism recognizable before it has fully operated. The Weimar Republic's tragedy was partly that it encountered one of the most skillfully executed manufactured crises in modern history without the institutional resilience to resist it. The institutions were young. The democratic culture was thin. The emergency powers clause had already been normalized through repeated use. The opposition was fractured and constrained by the very decree it needed to oppose. Other democracies, in other moments, have encountered versions of the manufactured crisis mechanism and survived not by being free of the mechanism's operation, but by having institutional resistance robust enough to limit it. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag burned. Whether van der Lubbe set it, alone. Whether he had help, he did not acknowledge. Whether the SA was there before him, we do not know for certain. The historical question remains open. What is not open is what followed. The fire decree was signed in 24 hours. The emergency powers were real. The arrests were real. The Enabling Act was real. The 444-94 vote was real. The concentration camps were real. The burned books were real. The banned parties were real. The eliminated trade unions were real. The one-party state was real. And the 55 million dead were real. The Reichstag fire is this season's final case study because it is the mechanism that makes everything else possible. The mechanism that converts the other 5 big lies from cultural artifacts into state policy. The manufactured enemy is dangerous. The manufactured defeat is dangerous. The manufactured nobility is dangerous. The manufactured guilt is dangerous. The manufactured perpetrator is dangerous. The manufactured crisis is the mechanism that gives the others teeth. That converts the propaganda into governance. That uses the lie not just to persuade but to eliminate the institutions that would otherwise resist. This is why this season ends here. Not because the Reichstag fire is the worst of the 6 stories the Katyn massacre and the Holocaust and the consequences of the stab-in-the-back myth claim that title collectively, but because the Reichstag fire is the mechanism that explains how all the others became. Not merely horrible, but catastrophically consequential. The manufactured crisis does not just tell a lie. It burns down the building where the truth would have been heard.